He didn't bark. He froze. And then he bit down like the truth was trying to escape. The terminal at Heathrow moved with its usual quiet urgency. The early morning crowd drifting between gates with cups of tea warming their hands and tired eyes fixed on departure boards flickering in soft amber light. A fine drizzle clung to the tall glass windows outside, blurring the runway into streaks of gray and gold. And somewhere beneath the hum of rolling suitcases and distant announcements, something shifted, something unseen, something only one creature in that vast building seemed to notice. Oliver Hayes walked with measured steps beside Rex, the lead resting loosely in his right hand, his left sleeve pulled just high enough to reveal the faded ink of a German shepherd etched into his skin, a mark not of pride but of memory, the kind that stays long after the noise has gone quiet. His posture straight, shoulders squared in that unmistakable way of a man who had once followed orders in places where hesitation cost more than time. Yet his eyes, calm and gray, carried something deeper, something watchful, as if he were always listening for a sound no one else could hear. Rex moved differently today, not distracted, not restless, but alert in a way that felt heavier, his ears flicking once, twice, his pace slowing until it stopped entirely beside a navy suitcase resting near a row of empty chairs, no tags out of place, no visible damage, nothing to suggest urgency. And yet the dog stood there, still as stone, his breath shallow, his gaze locked, the world around him fading into a blur of passing strangers and distant footsteps. Oliver felt it before he understood it, the subtle shift in the lead, the tension that traveled from the dog's body into his own hand. He didn't speak at first, didn't pull, didn't correct, because Rex wasn't disobeying, he was deciding. And that was something Oliver had learned to respect a long time ago, the kind of silence that meant more than any command ever could. Then it happened, without warning, without sound. Rex lunged forward and clamped his jaws onto the corner of the suitcase, not violently, not erratically, but with purpose, holding it as if it might slip away if he didn't, his body low, muscles taut, a quiet growl vibrating beneath his breath, not loud enough to draw attention, but deep enough to be felt by anyone standing close. A few heads turned, a man paused mid-step, a woman pulled her coat tighter, and somewhere overhead, a calm voice announced a delayed departure, as if nothing at all had changed, as if this moment did not matter. But Oliver knew better, he always had, because moments like this never arrived with noise. They arrived softly, wrapped in ordinary things, waiting to be noticed or ignored. "Rex," he said quietly, not a command, just a question, and the dog did not look at him, did not release, did not even shift his stance. His focus remained fixed on the case, as though something inside it had called to him in a language no human could hear. A man approached then, well-dressed, composed, his coat tailored neatly over his shoulders, his expression controlled in that careful way of someone who understood attention and preferred not to attract it. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone polite, but clipped, his eyes flicking briefly to the dog, then to Oliver, measuring, calculating, as if weighing inconvenience against patience. Oliver studied him for a second longer than most would, not confrontational, not accusatory, just present, and in that brief pause, something unsettled brushed against his instincts, not fear, not yet, just a quiet dissonance, the kind that doesn't announce itself. It lingers, waiting to be recognized. Rex's grip tightened slightly, his breath hitching, not aggressive, not panicked, but strained, as though he were listening to something beneath the surface, something faint and persistent, something that did not belong. The man's smile thinned, barely noticeable, but enough. "It's just a bag," he added, as if simplifying the world would make it true. Oliver didn't respond immediately, his gaze dropping briefly to Rex, then back to the suitcase, then to the man again, the pieces not yet forming a picture, but refusing to settle into something harmless. Around them, life continued, footsteps echoed, a child laughed somewhere near the cafe, cups clinked softly, and yet in the middle of it all, a single still point had formed, quiet, tense, waiting. Oliver inhaled slowly, steady, controlled, and then he said the only thing that mattered in that moment, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a certainty that came from experience rather than authority. "He doesn't do this without a reason." The words hung there, simple, unadorned, and for a fraction of a second, the man's composure shifted, just enough to be noticed, just enough to matter, and Rex, still holding the suitcase, let out the faintest sound, not quite a growl, not quite a whine, something in between, something that felt less like warning and more like recognition, as if whatever lay inside that ordinary piece of luggage was not just unusual, but wrong in a way that defied explanation. And in that quiet, suspended moment, Oliver understood one thing with absolute clarity. This was not about what they could see. It was about what they had almost missed. The moment stretched thin, like a wire pulled too tight to hold for much longer, and yet no one moved to break it. Not the man, not the crowd, and certainly not Rex, whose jaw remained locked around the suitcase, as though releasing it would mean losing something far more important than control. Oliver shifted his weight slightly, grounding himself in the polished floor beneath his boots. The faint reflection of overhead lights gliding across the surface like distant stars. He had learned long ago that stillness often revealed more than action, and right now, stillness was speaking loudly. The man's hand hovered near the handle of the suitcase, not grabbing, not pulling, just lingering, a hesitation so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. But Oliver noticed, because hesitation always meant something, especially when it came wrapped in calm. "I will need you to step back, sir," Oliver said, his tone even, respectful, but firm in a way that did not invite negotiation. The man exhaled softly through his nose, a controlled breath, and offered a slight nod that felt rehearsed rather than natural. "If that is necessary," he replied, stepping aside with measured compliance. Yet his eyes never left the suitcase, and that, more than anything, unsettled Oliver, because people who are truly unconcerned do not watch so closely, they do not calculate distance with their gaze. A pair of airport security officers approached, drawn by the subtle shift in energy rather than any raised voice. Their uniforms crisp, their expressions neutral but attentive. One of them glanced at Rex, then at Oliver. "Is there an issue here?" the officer asked, and Oliver did not rush his answer. He let the silence sit for a heartbeat longer, then another, as if allowing the situation to define itself. "My dog has indicated interest in this bag," he said finally, choosing his words carefully, not exaggerating, not diminishing, simply stating what was true, and in that moment, truth felt heavier than it should have. The officer nodded once, turning to the man. "Sir, we are going to conduct a routine check, if you would not mind." The request was polite, but it carried the quiet authority of procedure. The man's smile returned, thin but intact. "Of course," he said, his voice steady, almost too steady, like someone who had rehearsed this moment long before it arrived. And yet there was something beneath it, something faint, like a note slightly out of tune, not enough to alarm, but enough to linger. Rex shifted his grip slightly, not releasing, just adjusting, his body trembling now in a way that Oliver had rarely seen. Not fear, not aggression, but strain, as though he were holding himself between two instincts, one urging him to let go, the other refusing to allow it. Oliver crouched slowly beside him, lowering himself into the dog's world, where things were felt rather than explained. "Easy," he murmured, his voice soft, almost lost beneath the hum of the terminal. Rex did not respond with movement, but his ears flicked once, acknowledging, not reassurance, just awareness. The officer knelt beside the suitcase, his hands moving methodically, checking the exterior, the zips, the seams. Everything appeared ordinary, intact, unremarkable, and for a brief moment, doubt crept into the edges of the scene, subtle but present, the kind that makes people shift their stance, glance away, reconsider what they thought they saw. "Looks fine on the outside," the officer said quietly, almost to himself, and somewhere behind them, a few onlookers began to lose interest, their attention drifting back to flights and schedules and the ordinary rhythm of travel, because nothing visible demanded their concern anymore. Oliver did not move, did not stand, did not speak. His gaze remained fixed on Rex, and Rex remained fixed on the suitcase, as if the two were connected by something invisible, something that bypassed logic entirely. "Go on then," the second officer said, gesturing lightly, and with a careful motion, the first officer unzipped the case, The sound of metal teeth separating seemed louder than it should have been. Sharp against the quiet, the lid lifted slowly, revealing neatly folded clothes. Shirts, trousers, nothing out of place, nothing alarming, just the quiet order of an ordinary journey. And for a moment, the world exhaled, tension slipping away like mist under sunlight. The officer glanced at Oliver, then at Rex. "It appears to be clear," he said, not dismissive, but factual, and the words settled into the space between them, testing it, waiting to see if they would hold. A faint murmur rose from the nearby crowd, the subtle shift of opinion that follows relief, people stepping back into comfort, into certainty, into the belief that nothing unusual had occurred after all. But Rex did not release. He did not relax. He did not even blink. His body remained taut, his breathing uneven now, shallow and quick, and then, almost imperceptibly, he made a sound, not loud, not urgent, but wrong in a way Oliver could not ignore. It was not a warning. It was not a threat. It was something else entirely, something closer to discomfort, as though the very presence of the suitcase was pressing against him in a way that could not be seen. Oliver felt a tightening in his chest. Not fear, but recognition, the kind that comes from experience rather than evidence. He had heard that sound once before, in a place far from here, under very different skies, and it had meant one thing then, just as it did now. He rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his gaze shifting from the open suitcase to the lining along its base, smooth, unbroken, perfectly ordinary, and yet something about it felt too perfect, too precise, like a surface designed to hide rather than reveal. "Would you mind if we checked a bit further?" he asked, not looking at the officer this time, but at the man, because this was no longer about procedure, it was about permission, and the man hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But it was there, unmistakable, a pause where none should exist, and in that pause, everything changed, because hesitation, no matter how small, always tells the truth that words try to conceal. The pause did not last long, but it was enough for Oliver to see it, enough for Rex to feel it, and once something like that revealed itself, it could not be unseen. The man's expression recovered quickly, almost flawlessly. "If you must," he said, but the words carried a weight they had not held before, like a door closing somewhere deep behind them. Quiet, final, unnoticed by most, but not by Oliver, who had learned that the smallest shifts often marked the beginning of something far larger. The officer hesitated only briefly before nodding, his gloved hand hovering above the lining of the suitcase, the fabric smooth and tightly fitted, without wrinkles or irregularities, the kind of precision that suggested careful construction rather than casual use. He pressed lightly along the base, fingers tracing the edges, searching for something that did not belong, something hidden in plain sight. And for a moment, nothing answered back, no sound, no movement, just the quiet compliance of an ordinary object. Behind him, the second officer straightened slightly, his attention flicking between the man and Oliver, as though balancing protocol against instinct. The crowd had thinned now, drawn away by the gentle pull of routine, leaving behind only a handful of lingering glances and the distant murmur of announcements echoing through the terminal. Life continuing, unaware, as it always does when standing at the edge of something unseen. Rex's breathing grew sharper, more uneven, his body trembling in a rhythm that did not match the calm surroundings. Oliver crouched again, placing a steady hand along the dog's shoulder, not to restrain, but to anchor. "Stay with me," he murmured, his voice low, almost lost beneath the hum of air conditioning and footsteps. Rex did not look at him, his gaze fixed, unyielding, as if whatever lay beneath that thin layer of fabric held his entire focus, and perhaps more than that, perhaps something older, something deeper than training or command. The officer pressed again, firmer this time, and there it was, not a sound exactly, not something that could be clearly named, but a difference, a subtle resistance beneath the lining, as though the space beneath did not match the expectation of emptiness. He paused, his fingers lingering, then glanced up at Oliver, not alarmed, not yet, but questioning, and Oliver gave the slightest nod, permission without words, trust without explanation. Carefully, the officer traced the seam along the edge, his hand moving with deliberate caution. He slipped his fingers beneath the fabric, testing its give, and for a moment it held, resisting just enough to suggest it was meant to remain undisturbed. Then slowly, quietly, it lifted, revealing a narrow gap beneath, a hidden compartment, precise, measured, intentional. The air seemed to change, not visibly, not dramatically, but in a way that pressed softly against the senses, as if the space itself had shifted. The officer leaned closer, his breath controlled, his movements careful, and within that concealed space, something rested, not large, not immediately striking, but wrong in a way that settled deep rather than loud. A small metal container, smooth, sealed, its surface unmarked, sat nestled within the compartment, and though it did not move in any obvious way, there was a faint sense of presence about it, something that felt out of place in a world of fabric and clothing and ordinary travel, the kind of wrongness that did not shout, but whispered persistently until it could no longer be ignored. Rex let out a low sound, softer now, almost strained, his grip loosening just slightly, not because the tension had passed, but because it had shifted, his body leaning forward as though drawn closer by something he could not fully understand. Oliver felt it too, not physically, not in any measurable way, but in that quiet, instinctive part of the mind that recognizes danger before it is named. The officer drew back slowly, his expression no longer neutral, but not yet alarmed, caught in that space between recognition and response. This was not visible during the initial check. He said carefully, his voice controlled, but edged with something new, something cautious, and the second officer stepped closer, his gaze fixed on the container, his posture tightening just enough to signal awareness. The man stood still, too still, his hands relaxed at his sides, his expression composed, but the calm now felt different, no longer effortless, but maintained, held in place like a mask that required effort to wear. Oliver watched him closely, not with accusation, but with attention, the kind that notices what others overlook, and in that moment, the silence between them grew heavier than any spoken word. "What is it?" the second officer asked quietly, not expecting an answer, but needing to fill the space. The first officer did not respond immediately. His eyes remained on the container, as if waiting for it to reveal itself, but objects like that never do. They do not explain, they do not justify, they simply exist, and it is up to those who find them to understand what they mean. Rex shifted again, his body lowering slightly, not in submission, but in focus, his ears angled forward, his breathing uneven, and Oliver realized then that this was not over, not even close, because whatever had drawn Rex here had not yet finished speaking, and whatever truth lay hidden within that small, sealed object was only beginning to surface, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone to listen closely enough to hear it. No one reached for it at first, and that hesitation felt heavier than any alarm ever could, because when something truly does not belong, instinct often arrives before instruction. The two officers exchanged a glance that lasted no more than a second, yet carried the quiet understanding of men trained to recognize when routine ends and something else begins. The first officer straightened slowly, drawing a measured breath as though the air itself required caution now. "We are going to escalate this," he said, his voice calm, controlled, but no longer casual, and with that, the space around them shifted again, subtle but undeniable, like a room acknowledging a truth it had not wanted to face. Oliver remained where he was, one hand resting lightly against Rex's shoulder, feeling the fine tremor still running through the dog's body. Not panic, not fear, but a kind of sustained alertness that did not fade simply because the object had been found. If anything, it had deepened. Rex's eyes did not leave the small container, his focus absolute, as if the surface of it meant nothing compared to what lay beneath its silence. The second officer spoke quietly into his radio, his words precise, coded, designed to carry meaning without drawing attention. And though the surrounding crowd had thinned, a few people still lingered at the edges, sensing something without fully understanding it, their movements slower now, their conversations quieter, as though the atmosphere itself had asked them to listen. The man stood still, composed, his posture unchanged, yet something about him no longer aligned with the calm he projected. It was not visible in any obvious way, but it was there, in the slight delay before he responded, in the careful way his gaze avoided the container now, as if acknowledging it too directly might give something away that could not be taken back. "Is this really necessary?" he asked, his tone measured, but lacking the earlier confidence, and the officer did not answer immediately, because necessity had already answered for itself. A few moments passed, quiet but dense, until two additional personnel approached, their presence more deliberate, their pace steady, carrying with them the weight of procedure that only arrives when something crosses from suspicion into significance. One of them knelt beside the suitcase, his attention fixed on the container, while the other stood slightly back, observing, assessing, the kind of silent communication that requires no words. Oliver shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not retreating, simply adjusting his stance as he watched, his eyes moving from the container to Rex, then briefly to the man, mapping the unseen connections between them, because in moments like this, everything is connected, even when it appears separate. The kneeling officer extended a gloved hand, stopping just short of touching the container. As if testing the boundary between observation and action, he studied it carefully, noting its shape, its placement, its stillness, and then he paused, his head tilting slightly, listening, not with his ears alone, but with the trained awareness that had kept him steady in uncertain situations before. "Do you feel that?" he murmured, almost to himself, and though the others did not immediately respond, the question lingered, because once asked, it invited perception. Oliver felt it then, faint, almost imagined, a subtle warmth in the air near the open suitcase, not strong enough to be measured, but present enough to be noticed, the kind of detail most would dismiss. But Oliver had learned not to dismiss anything that appeared without explanation, especially when Rex had already spoken in the only way he knew how. Rex shifted again, a low, strained sound escaping him, softer than before, but heavier, as though whatever signal he had sensed was not fading, but intensifying, and Oliver lowered his voice, barely audible. "It is all right," he said, though he was not certain whether he was speaking to the dog or to himself. The officer withdrew his hand slowly, rising to his feet. "We are not opening that here," he said quietly, and there was no argument, no disagreement, because everyone present understood that some things require distance before they can be understood safely, and the decision settled over them like a line drawn in quiet certainty. The second officer nodded once, already moving to secure the immediate area, his gestures calm but purposeful, guiding the remaining onlookers further back with polite firmness, the space widening, creating a buffer not just of distance, but of control, and with each step back the crowd took, the center of the moment grew more defined, more focused, like a lens, narrowing onto a single point. The man's composure faltered then, not dramatically, not enough to draw attention from anyone not already watching him closely. But Oliver saw it, the brief tightening of his jaw, the flicker in his eyes, the smallest shift in his stance as though recalculating a situation that was no longer within his control, and for the first time, he spoke without that careful polish. "I have a flight to catch," he said, and though the words were ordinary, the weight behind them was not, because they carried urgency now, not impatience, but something deeper, something closer to concern. Oliver met his gaze calmly, not confrontational, not aggressive, simply present, and in that quiet exchange, something unspoken passed between them, recognition perhaps, or understanding, the kind that does not require words to exist. Rex finally released the suitcase, his jaw loosening slowly, but he did not step back, he did not relax, he remained there, watchful, his body still angled toward the container, as if letting go of the physical hold did not mean letting go of what he had sensed, and Oliver rested his hand more firmly against him, grounding, steadying, a silent acknowledgement that whatever had begun here was not yet finished. In the distance, a faint sound approached, not loud, not urgent, but distinct enough to be recognized, the low hum of specialized response drawing nearer, and with it came the quiet realization that this moment, small and almost unnoticed by the world beyond this terminal, had shifted into something far greater than anyone passing through that morning could possibly understand. Because sometimes the most dangerous things do not arrive with noise or spectacle. They arrive sealed, silent, carried. Through ordinary places, waiting only for one soul, or one dog, willing to notice what everyone else is too busy to see. The low hum grew closer, steady and deliberate, and with it came a shift that no announcement could capture, the kind that moves quietly through trained minds before it ever reaches the public eye. A pair of specialized officers entered the terminal space with calm precision, their presence understated yet unmistakable, their uniforms marked not by authority alone but by purpose. One carried a reinforced case. The other scanned the scene with a gaze that missed nothing and acknowledged everything. And when their eyes settled on the open suitcase, on the small concealed compartment, on the container resting within it, there was no confusion, no hesitation, only recognition. Oliver stepped slightly aside, not retreating, but making space, his hand still resting on Rex, who remained rigid, his attention unbroken, as though the arrival of new personnel had not lessened what he felt, only confirmed it. The first officer knelt where the others had been, his movements slow, controlled, deliberate in a way that suggested not caution alone, but respect for something that demanded it. He did not reach immediately. Instead, he observed the container, the lining, the structure of the hidden compartment, mapping its presence as though understanding it required more than sight. "You did well to stop this," he said quietly, not looking at Oliver yet, his voice carrying a calm that did not soothe, but steadied, the kind that belongs to those who deal with uncertainty as part of their daily work. Oliver gave a small nod, not as acceptance of praise, but as acknowledgement of shared responsibility, because this was no longer about who had found it, but about what it was and what it meant. The second specialized officer set the reinforced case down gently, opening it with a soft click that seemed to echo more than it should have. Inside, neatly arranged equipment waited, each piece designed for purpose, each movement that followed measured and precise. He retrieved a compact device, its surface matte, unassuming, yet purposeful, and held it just above the container without making contact, as if listening through space rather than touch. The air seemed to hold its breath, not literally, but in the way people do when they sense something significant unfolding. Even those at the far edges of the scene had grown quieter now, their movements slower, their conversations reduced to murmurs, because uncertainty, when felt deeply enough, spreads without explanation. Rex shifted slightly, his stance lowering, his ears angled forward, his focus narrowing further, and Oliver felt the subtle pressure of the dog's body against his leg, not seeking reassurance, but maintaining connection, as though the presence of something unseen required grounding in something known. The device emitted no sound that others could hear, but the officer's expression changed, not dramatically, but enough, a slight tightening around the eyes, a brief stillness before he exhaled, controlled and steady. "There is activity," he said, his tone quiet, but clear, and the words settled into the space with a weight that did not need volume to be understood. The second officer nodded once, already preparing the next step. "We will contain it here," he replied, his voice equally calm, equally measured, as though this was a path they had walked before, even if the specifics were new. The man stood where he had been, but the stillness around him had shifted again, no longer composed, no longer calculated, but held together, maintained with effort rather than ease. His gaze flicked once toward the container, then away, as if acknowledging it directly now carried consequence, and Oliver saw it clearly, the difference between someone who owns an object and someone who fears what it might reveal. "Sir, we will need you to remain with us," one of the officers said, not forceful, not confrontational, but definitive, and the man gave a small nod, though his response came a fraction too late to feel natural. "Of course," he said, yet the word lacked conviction, like a statement spoken out of necessity rather than agreement. The specialized officer carefully positioned a containment sleeve around the container, his hands steady, his movements precise, each action deliberate, ensuring that nothing was disturbed more than necessary. And as the sleeve settled into place, Rex let out a soft exhale, not relief, but a slight easing of the tension that had held him since the moment he first stopped beside the suitcase. As though the act of containing the object had shifted something invisible, reduced its reach, if only slightly. Oliver watched closely, his mind moving not through fear, but through understanding, piecing together what he could from what he saw and what he felt, because in situations like this, clarity does not arrive all at once. It builds, slowly, quietly, through observation and instinct combined. The officer lifted the container with careful control, placing it into the reinforced case, securing it with a series of measured steps that spoke of training and repetition. And once the lid closed, the atmosphere shifted again, not returning to normal, but moving away from the edge it had hovered on, like a storm that had passed just close enough to be felt without fully arriving. Rex finally eased his stance, not fully relaxed, but no longer rigid, his gaze softening slightly as he looked up at Oliver for the first time since it began. And in that brief moment, there was something unspoken between them, something that did not need words, because both understood what had just happened, not in full detail, not in complete clarity, but in essence. A warning had been given, and it had been heard. Oliver placed a gentle hand against Rex's neck, his touch firm but quiet, grounding them both in the present. And as the officers began to move the secured case away, the world beyond their small circle slowly resumed its rhythm. Footsteps returning, voices rising, announcements continuing as though nothing extraordinary had taken place. And yet for those who had stood within that moment, nothing felt entirely the same. Because sometimes the most important events do not announce themselves to the world. They pass quietly, carried by those who notice, contained by those who act, and remembered only by those who understand how close something unseen came to becoming something far greater. The case clicked shut with a finality that seemed to draw a line under everything that had just unfolded, yet the silence that followed did not feel like an ending. It felt like a pause, the kind that lingers between cause and consequence. And as the specialized officers carried the secured container away with careful, measured steps, the weight of what had been contained did not leave with it. It remained, faint but present, settling into the awareness of those who had witnessed it. Oliver stood still for a moment longer, his hand resting against Rex, feeling the gradual slowing of the dog's breath, the subtle easing of tension that had held his body like a drawn bowstring, not entirely gone, but no longer at its peak. And when Rex finally shifted his gaze fully to Oliver, there was something in his eyes that went beyond training, beyond instinct, something closer to understanding, as though he knew not just that something had been wrong, but that it had been stopped. The officers who had first responded began to re-establish the normal flow of the terminal, their movements efficient but unobtrusive, guiding people back into their routines with polite gestures and calm instructions, the edges of the moment softening, folding back into the quiet rhythm of departure boards and rolling luggage. Yet beneath it all, a thread of awareness remained, subtle, unspoken, carried in the glances exchanged between those who had been close enough to sense that something had nearly crossed a line it was never meant to reach. The man remained where he stood, though his stillness no longer held the same composure. It felt held together rather than effortless, his shoulders slightly tighter, his gaze no longer steady, flickering now between the officers and the path where the case had been taken, as if trying to follow something he could no longer reach. And when one of the officers approached him again, his response came slower this time, less certain. "Am I free to go?" he asked, his voice controlled, but lacking the quiet confidence it had carried before. And the officer's answer was simple, calm, and immovable. "Not at this moment, sir." No explanation, no elaboration, just a boundary set in place. Oliver watched the exchange without stepping closer, his role no longer active. Yet his presence remained anchored, because leaving too quickly would feel like stepping away from something unfinished, and Rex seemed to feel the same, his body still angled slightly toward the space where the suitcase had been, as though the absence itself held meaning, as though what had been removed had left behind an imprint that would take time to fade. A faint vibration passed through the floor, barely noticeable, the distant movement of vehicles beyond the terminal walls, the world continuing in its vast, indifferent motion, and Oliver drew a slow breath, grounding himself in the present, in the ordinary details that framed extraordinary moments, the hum of lighting above, the scent of coffee drifting from a nearby kiosk, the quiet murmur of travelers returning to their journeys. Because it is always the ordinary that absorbs the extraordinary, holding it without comment, allowing it to pass without spectacle. One of the specialized officers returned briefly, his expression composed, but carrying a trace of something unspoken. He paused beside Oliver, his gaze dropping to Rex for a moment. "Your dog," he said quietly, "picked up on something most would have missed." And though the words were simple, they carried a depth that did not require explanation. Oliver nodded once, his hand brushing lightly along Rex's neck. "Not as a gesture of pride, but of recognition. He always does," he replied, his voice low, steady, because trust like that is not built in moments like this. It is built long before, in quieter places, through repetition and faith. The officer gave a slight nod in return, then moved on, drawn back into the unfolding procedures that would follow, leaving Oliver and Rex standing at the edge of something they had already stepped through, and now, slowly, were stepping away from. Rex shifted closer, pressing lightly against Oliver's leg, not seeking reassurance, but reaffirming connection, the kind that does not require words. Oliver adjusted the lead gently, not to guide, but to align, and together they began to move again, their pace unhurried, their path leading them back into the flow of the terminal, into the anonymity that follows moments no one fully understands. As they walked, Oliver glanced once over his shoulder, not out of doubt, but out of habit, the kind that comes from years of knowing that what is left behind sometimes matters as much as what is carried forward. The space where the suitcase had been was now empty, indistinguishable from the rest of the terminal, no mark, no sign, nothing to suggest what had occurred. And yet Oliver knew, just as Rex knew, that absence does not mean nothing happened. It simply means it was handled before it could become something else. The morning continued, flights departed, announcements echoed, people moved with purpose and distraction, and somewhere beyond the walls of the terminal, the secured container would be examined, understood, contained further if needed, its purpose uncovered by those trained to read what others cannot. But here, in this place, the moment had already done what it needed to do. It had revealed itself just enough to be stopped, and no more. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears relaxing for the first time since it began, his stride returning to its natural rhythm, and Oliver felt the quiet shift in him, the release not of memory, but of tension, because some things leave a mark that does not fade quickly, even when the danger has passed. They moved past a row of windows where the gray morning light filtered in, soft and muted, reflecting faintly on the polished floor, and for a brief moment, everything felt still again, not empty, not unaware, but settled, like a surface after a ripple has passed, and Oliver's gaze softened, not in relief, but in understanding, because he had seen this before, in different places, under different circumstances. The quiet moments where something unseen had been recognized just in time. He did not speak, did not need to, and Rex did not look back again, because whatever had called to him had been answered, not with words, not with explanation, but with action, and sometimes that is all that is required, a signal given, a signal heard, and a choice made before the world ever realizes how close it came to something it could not have undone. They should have walked away from it then, allowed the moment to dissolve completely into the rhythm of departures and arrivals. But something did not settle, not fully, not in Oliver, and certainly not in Rex, because as they moved through the terminal, past rows of seats and quiet conversations, past the soft glow of shop fronts and the muted reflections on polished floors, there was a faint pull that lingered, something unfinished, something not entirely resolved. Rex slowed again, not abruptly, not with the same intensity as before, but enough for Oliver to notice, enough to feel the shift through the lead, subtle but deliberate, the dog's head turning slightly, ears angling back toward the direction they had come from, not confused, not uncertain, but attentive, as though something had changed after they left, something small, but significant. Oliver stopped without thinking, his body responding before his mind caught up, his gaze following Rex's line of sight, back toward the corridor where the officers had taken the secured container, the space now distant, partially obscured by the movement of people, yet still connected in a way that could not be explained. "What is it?" he murmured, not expecting an answer in words, but trusting the instinct that had already proven itself once that morning. Rex did not pull, did not resist. He simply stood there, still again, his body quiet but alert, And then he did something Oliver had only seen a handful of times before. He took a slow step forward, not toward the path ahead, but slightly to the side, adjusting his position as if aligning himself with something unseen, something that did not exist in the visible layout of the terminal. And that was when Oliver felt it again, faint, almost imagined, that same subtle shift in the air, not temperature, not sound, but presence, the kind that lingers at the edge of awareness, refusing to be ignored. A voice echoed overhead, announcing a boarding call, ordinary, routine, grounding, but it did not anchor the moment the way it should have, because whatever Rex was sensing did not belong to schedules or gates or destinations. It belonged to something else entirely, something that had not fully left with the container. Oliver exhaled slowly, steadying himself, and turned, not fully, but enough to face back toward the corridor, his instincts aligning with Rex's, because experience had taught him one thing above all: when something feels unfinished, it usually is. They retraced a few steps, moving against the gentle flow of passengers, unnoticed by most, just another handler and his dog adjusting course. Nothing remarkable, nothing urgent, yet each step carried a quiet weight, the kind that builds not from fear, but from awareness. As they neared the corridor, the atmosphere shifted again, more subtly this time, less pronounced, but still present, like the faint echo of something that had already passed. And Rex's pace slowed further, his breathing steady but focused, his gaze narrowing, scanning not the people, not the surroundings, but the spaces between them, the gaps, the unnoticed corners where things can remain hidden long after attention has moved on. Oliver's eyes followed, searching not for what was obvious, but for what might have been overlooked, because in moments like this, it is rarely the first discovery that holds the full truth. It is what follows, what lingers, what refuses to settle even after the initial problem has been removed. A member of airport staff passed by, offering a polite nod, unaware, unaffected, and for a moment, everything seemed normal again. The corridor just another passage between terminals, the hum of distant movement blending into a familiar backdrop. But Rex did not move on. He stopped near a section of wall where a row of service doors lined the side, unmarked, functional, easily ignored by anyone without reason to notice them. And there, he lowered his head slightly, not touching, not alerting, loudly, but focusing, intensely, as though the absence of something had left behind a trace. Oliver crouched beside him, his movements slow, deliberate, his hand resting lightly along Rex's back, feeling the subtle tension returning, not as sharp as before, but present, persistent. "You are still hearing something, aren't you?" he said quietly, more statement than question, and Rex's ears flicked once, a small acknowledgement, but enough. Footsteps approached behind them. One of the earlier officers returning, his expression neutral but curious. "Everything all right?" he asked, his tone casual, yet attentive, and Oliver did not answer immediately. His gaze fixed on the area Rex was watching, the plain surface of the wall, the closed doors, the unnoticed space that now felt less empty than it appeared. "He is not done," Oliver said finally, his voice low, steady, carrying no urgency, but no doubt either, and the officer paused, considering, because doubt is easier to dismiss when nothing has been proven, but much harder when something already has. The officer stepped closer, his posture shifting from casual to attentive, his gaze following Rex's focus, and though he saw nothing unusual, nothing out of place, the memory of the suitcase, of the hidden compartment, of the container, lingered just enough to prevent him from dismissing this outright. "What do you think he is picking up?" he asked, not skeptical, but searching, and Oliver shook his head slightly. Not in uncertainty, but in honesty. "I do not know," he replied. "But whatever it is, it did not leave completely." The words settled between them, quiet, but heavy, because they suggested something larger than a single object, something more complex than a contained threat, and Rex remained still, focused, patient, as though waiting for the next piece to reveal itself, because instinct does not rush, it waits, it listens, it holds until the truth surfaces, and in that quiet corridor, away from the noise and movement of the main terminal, it felt as though something was still there, something small, something hidden, something that had not yet been seen, but had already been felt. The corridor did not look different from any other part of the terminal, just a stretch of neutral walls and functional doors, the kind designed to be ignored, passed through without thought. And yet the stillness here carried a different weight, quieter than the main hall, more contained, as though sound itself hesitated before settling. Rex remained fixed in place, his posture steady, his head slightly lowered, his attention narrowed with a precision that no training alone could explain, and Oliver felt it again, that faint pressure in the air, not physical, not measurable, but present enough to shift the way he stood, the way he breathed, the way he listened. The officer beside him took a slow step closer to the row of service doors, his eyes scanning the surfaces, the hinges, the seams where structure meets function. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing suggested intrusion, and yet the absence of evidence no longer carried the same reassurance it once did, not after what had already been uncovered. These are maintenance access points, the officer said quietly, more to himself than to Oliver, as if naming them might restore their normalcy. But the words did not change the way the space felt. Rex shifted again, not forward, not backward, but slightly to the left, aligning himself with one specific door, unmarked, identical to the others, and yet, to him, not the same. His ears angled, his breathing slow but focused, and then he did something subtle but undeniable. He sat, not in rest, but in signal, a deliberate posture, controlled, precise. The kind that does not ask for attention but commands it without sound. Oliver did not question it. He never did when Rex chose clarity over hesitation. "This one," he said, his voice calm, steady, and the officer paused, his gaze settling on the door Rex faced, a moment of consideration passing through him before he reached for his radio, speaking in low, measured tones, requesting access, not urgent, but immediate enough to matter. The seconds that followed stretched quietly, not tense in the way of visible danger, but dense with anticipation, the kind that builds beneath the surface, unnoticed by those not directly within it. Footsteps echoed faintly from the main terminal, distant, disconnected, as though belonging to another world entirely, and Oliver remained crouched beside Rex, his hand resting lightly against the dog's shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of breath, the contained readiness that had not wavered since. The moment this began, a staff member arrived with a key card, his expression polite but curious. Unaware of the depth beneath the request, he unlocked the door with a soft click, then stepped back without question, leaving the boundary open, yet untouched. The officer moved forward, pausing at the threshold, not entering immediately, but observing, allowing his senses to adjust to the shift from open space to enclosed, from movement to stillness. The room beyond was small, functional, filled with equipment and storage units, nothing unusual at first glance, just the quiet order of maintenance tools and supplies, arranged with practical efficiency, the kind of space designed to exist without notice. Yet Rex did not relax, his posture unchanged, his focus extending beyond the doorway, deeper, as if the surface view meant nothing compared to what lay beneath it. Oliver stood slowly, his movements deliberate, and stepped closer, his gaze sweeping the room with the same quiet attention, not searching for the obvious, but for the subtle, the overlooked, the detail that does not belong, because in places like this, it is rarely the visible that matters, it is what hides behind it. The officer entered cautiously, his steps measured, his eyes moving from shelf to shelf, from corner to corner, and for a moment, nothing answered. No sound, no movement, just the quiet hum of systems running in the background. And yet the feeling remained, persistent, refusing to dissolve, as though something within that space had not yet revealed itself. Rex stood again, rising from his seated position with controlled precision, and without waiting for a command, he took a single step forward, crossing the threshold, his nose lowering slightly, not touching, but sensing, tracing something invisible through the air. And Oliver followed, not leading, but allowing, trusting the path being shown rather than directing it. The room felt smaller once inside, the walls closer, the air stiller, and as Rex moved toward the far corner, near a stack of storage cases, his pace slowed further, his attention narrowing to a single point, a plain container, no different in appearance from the others, no markings, no signs of disturbance, yet to him, unmistakable. The officer approached cautiously, his gaze fixed, his awareness heightened by everything that had come before, and he reached out, not to open, but to assess, his hand hovering just above the surface. And then he stopped, his expression shifting, not alarm, not fear, but recognition, the kind that comes when something aligns too closely with what has already been found. Oliver felt it then, clearer than before, not in the object itself, but in the pattern forming, the connection between the suitcase, the hidden compartment, the container that had been removed, and now this, another piece, quieter, smaller, but undeniably linked, because whatever had been carried into this place had not been alone. It had been part of something larger, something distributed, something designed not to rely on a single point of failure. Rex let out a low, steady breath, not strained now, but certain, as though confirming what he had sensed from the beginning. And Oliver's gaze hardened slightly, not with fear, but with understanding, because this was no longer about one discovery. It was about a pattern, and patterns do not end where they begin. They extend, they repeat, they hide in plain sight until someone sees the connection. The officer lowered his hand slowly, turning to Oliver, their eyes meeting in quiet agreement. No words needed, because both understood what this meant, not in full detail, not yet, but enough to know that this moment, this second discovery, had shifted everything again, because the first had been a warning. But this was confirmation, and in that small, overlooked room, away from the noise and motion of the terminal, the truth had begun to take shape, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet certainty that could no longer be ignored. The room seemed smaller now, not because its walls had moved, but because the truth inside it had begun to take shape. And once something unseen starts to become known, space itself feels different, more confined, more deliberate, as though it is holding something it was never meant to contain. The officer's hand hovered for a moment longer above the plain storage container before withdrawing slowly, his breath measured, his posture steady. But the stillness around him carried a new weight, not uncertainty anymore, but recognition settling into place. Oliver stepped closer, not rushing, not reacting outwardly, but his awareness sharpened, his gaze moving between Rex and the container, mapping the connection that had brought them here, because this was no longer about instinct alone, it was about confirmation, the kind that shifts a moment from suspicion into something far more grounded. Rex stood, unmoving, his body aligned with the object, his attention absolute. And yet there was a subtle difference now. The tension that had once driven him forward had softened into something steadier, more resolved, as though the act of finding had replaced the urgency of searching. And in that quiet shift, Oliver understood that Rex was no longer asking a question, he was giving an answer. The officer glanced back toward the doorway, signaling quietly to the colleague outside, his voice low as he spoke into the radio once more, not raising alarm, not yet, but marking the importance of what had been found, because patterns, once seen, cannot be ignored, they demand completion. A second specialized unit was already en route, their presence anticipated before it was confirmed, because this situation had moved beyond isolated discovery. It had become something connected, something deliberate, something that required a wider understanding. The container sat there, ordinary in every visible way, its surface clean, its edges aligned, nothing to suggest significance to anyone passing by, without reason to look deeper. And that was precisely what made it matter, because things designed to remain hidden rarely draw attention to themselves. They rely on being overlooked, on blending seamlessly into the environment that surrounds them. Oliver crouched slowly beside Rex once more, his hand resting lightly against the dog's neck, feeling the steady rhythm beneath his palm, no longer strained, no longer urgent, but grounded, certain. "You found the second piece," he murmured quietly, not for anyone else to hear, just a recognition spoken into the stillness, and Rex's ears flicked once, a small acknowledgement that needed no further explanation. The officer stepped closer again, this time not hesitating as before, but still moving with care, his hand hovering near the container, assessing not just what it was, but how it fit into what had already been removed from the suitcase, because the connection was no longer theoretical, it was present, tangible, waiting to be understood fully. "We are going to treat this as linked," he said calmly, his voice directed toward Oliver, but carrying the weight of procedure, and Oliver nodded once, because there was no doubt left, not after the pattern had revealed itself so clearly. First the concealed object within the luggage, now this, placed separately, quietly, as though meant to exist unnoticed until a certain moment, a certain alignment. The air in the room remained still, but it no longer felt empty. It felt occupied by understanding, by the slow realization that whatever had been carried into this place had been designed with intention, not random, not accidental, but structured, layered, hidden across multiple points to avoid simple detection, and that alone changed everything. Rex shifted slightly, stepping half a pace back, not retreating, but creating space, as though his role in this moment had been fulfilled, and now it was for others to continue, and Oliver rose with him, his movements calm, his presence steady, not withdrawing, but allowing the process to unfold beyond instinct into action. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed faintly in the corridor, measured, purposeful, and within moments the additional team arrived, their expressions composed, their focus immediate. They took in the scene quickly, efficiently, no wasted motion, no unnecessary words, because by now the situation had defined itself clearly enough. One of them knelt beside the container, his actions mirroring those taken earlier with the first object, careful, deliberate, assessing before engaging, while another prepared the necessary equipment, the quiet precision of trained response filling the small room with a sense of controlled progression. Oliver stepped slightly aside, giving them space, yet his attention did not waver. His gaze remained on the unfolding process, not out of concern, but out of understanding, because this moment was no longer about discovery alone. It was about connection, about confirming what had already begun to reveal itself, piece by piece. The officer who had first responded stood beside him now, his posture less uncertain than before, his voice low as he spoke. If there is a second, there may be more. And the words did not carry alarm, only acknowledgement, the quiet acceptance of what logic now suggested, and Oliver nodded once, his expression unchanged, because that thought had already formed in his mind the moment Rex had stopped again in the corridor. Rex glanced up at him briefly, his gaze softer now, no longer fixed, no longer searching, just present, and in that brief look, there was something deeper than training, something closer to trust fulfilled, as though he knew his part had been enough, that what needed to be found had been found, at least for now. The container was carefully lifted, secured, and placed into a reinforced case, the same controlled process as before, precise, methodical, leaving nothing to chance, and as the lid closed once more, the room seemed to release a fraction of its weight, not entirely, but enough to shift the balance, because two discoveries had changed the shape of the situation, turning it from a single anomaly into something structured, something intentional, something that would now be followed beyond this space, beyond this moment. Oliver exhaled slowly, steady, not in relief, but in clarity, because the uncertainty of what Rex had sensed was gone, replaced by the certainty of what had been found. And though the full picture remained incomplete, enough had been revealed to understand that this was not an isolated event. It was part of something larger, something that had been placed quietly within the ordinary flow of life, waiting, unnoticed, until the right eyes, or the right instincts, chose to see it. And as the team began to move again, carrying the secured container out of the room, back into the corridor, and beyond into the wider system that would handle what came next, Oliver remained still for a moment longer, his hand resting lightly against Rex, his gaze following the path of what had been uncovered, knowing that while this part of the story had come into focus, the rest of it was only just beginning to unfold, quietly, patiently, just beyond what could yet be seen. The corridor felt different as they stepped back into it, not because anything had visibly changed, but because understanding had settled into the space, quiet and undeniable, and once something hidden reveals itself even partially, the ordinary no longer feels entirely safe. The world does not shift in appearance, but it shifts in meaning, and Oliver could feel that difference in the way he moved, in the way his eyes traced details he might have once ignored, in the way silence now carried weight instead of absence. The team moved ahead with the secured case, their pace controlled, their focus forward, and the officer who had remained with Oliver glanced back briefly, as though measuring whether to say something or to leave the moment unspoken. "We are coordinating with Central Command," he said finally, his tone calm, but layered with the quiet gravity of what that meant. Not escalation in the visible sense, but expansion, the kind that spreads beyond a single location into a wider network of awareness. And Oliver nodded once, because that was the only direction this could take now. Once a pattern reveals itself, it does not remain contained within one room or one corridor. It extends, it echoes outward, and it demands to be followed. Rex walked beside him now, no longer pulling, no longer resisting, his stride even, but there was still a trace of something in his posture, a residual alertness, as though his instincts had not fully released the thread they had been following, and Oliver did not expect them to. Not yet, because whatever had been uncovered had not reached its end. It had simply reached a point where others would take over the next phase. They re-entered the main terminal, and the contrast was immediate. The sound returned first, voices, footsteps, announcements, the steady rhythm of travel resuming around them as if nothing had ever interrupted it. People moved with purpose, unaware, carrying bags, checking tickets, watching clocks, and Oliver felt the familiar disconnect between what the world sees and what it almost never notices. The quiet truths that pass through ordinary spaces without leaving a mark. A senior officer approached from the far side of the terminal, his presence composed, his gaze direct, and when he reached them, he did not waste words. "Hayes," he said, not as a question, but as recognition, and Oliver inclined his head slightly. Acknowledgement without formality, because rank mattered less in moments like this than clarity did. The officer's eyes moved briefly to Rex, then back to Oliver. "We have 2 confirmed finds, both concealed, both linked," he said, his voice low enough to remain within their small circle. "And we are reviewing entry points, surveillance, and associated individuals." He paused for a fraction of a second, then added, "The man you flagged is being held for questioning." The words were simple, but they carried the quiet conclusion of something that had begun with a single instinct and had now unfolded into something structured, something undeniable. Oliver exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in understanding, because the pieces were beginning to align, not fully, but enough to see the outline of intent, and intent, once revealed, changes everything. Rex shifted slightly beside him, his head turning once more, not sharply, not urgently, but with a faint curiosity, as though sensing the echo of something that had not yet entirely faded, and Oliver noticed, his hand brushing lightly along the dog's neck, grounding, steadying. "You did your part," he murmured quietly, and this time, Rex looked at him fully, his gaze calm, steady, as though the message had been received. The officer continued, "We will need a full account from you, timeline, observations, everything." And Oliver nodded, because that was expected, because instinct may begin the process, but detail completes it, and every second, every movement, every hesitation matters once the situation expands beyond the immediate. A brief silence settled between them, not empty, but reflective, and then the officer added something softer, something less procedural. "If your dog had not stopped," he did not finish the sentence, he did not need to, because some outcomes are understood without being spoken, and Oliver did not respond with words, only a slight tightening of his jaw, a quiet acknowledgement of what could have been, and what had been prevented. Around them, the terminal continued without pause. A child laughed somewhere near a shop front. A trolley rolled past with a soft metallic rhythm. A departure was announced in a calm, measured voice, and the normalcy of it all felt almost surreal, because beneath it, something significant had just passed, unseen by most, unrecorded in any visible way, yet very real to those who had stood within it. Rex's posture softened further now, the last trace of tension easing from his frame, his breathing returning fully to its natural rhythm, and Oliver felt the shift, the quiet return to balance, because instinct, once fulfilled, does not linger unnecessarily. It resolves, it releases, it moves on, and that was what Rex was doing now, not forgetting, but letting go of the immediate pull that had guided him. The officer gave a final nod. "We will take it from here," he said, not dismissing, but concluding this part of their involvement, and Oliver accepted it without resistance, because he understood that moments like this belong to many hands once they unfold, not just the ones who first uncover them. He adjusted the lead gently, turning slightly toward the open space of the terminal, and Rex followed without hesitation, their movement smooth, unhurried, as though they were simply continuing a routine patrol, nothing more, nothing less. And in a way, that was exactly what it was, because the extraordinary rarely announces itself. It hides within the ordinary, waiting for the right moment, the right instinct, the right connection to bring it into the light. As they walked, Oliver allowed himself one brief glance back, not out of doubt, but out of habit, the kind that stays with you long after moments like this pass. And the space behind them looked exactly as it should, calm, controlled, unremarkable. And yet he knew, just as Rex knew, that something had moved through it, something that had been seen just in time, and that knowledge did not fade. It stayed, quiet, steady. A reminder that sometimes the most important warnings come without sound, without signal, without anything at all except the instinct of one who chooses to listen, and the trust of one who knows when to act. The terminal lights seemed softer now, not dimmer, but gentler, as though the intensity of what had passed had subtly altered the way Oliver perceived everything around him. And as he and Rex moved along the concourse once more, the rhythm of the morning reasserted itself with quiet determination, footsteps steady, voices layered, the distant hum of engines beyond the glass blending into the ordinary symphony of travel. Yet beneath it all, something remained, not tension, not urgency, but awareness, the kind that does not fade when the moment ends. It settles instead, becoming part of how one sees the world moving forward. Rex walked at Oliver's side with a calm that had returned fully now, his posture relaxed, his gaze no longer scanning with that sharp, searching intensity, but attentive in a quieter way, as though whatever thread he had followed had reached its natural conclusion. And Oliver could feel that shift clearly through the lead, the absence of pressure, the steady alignment, the unspoken signal that the work, at least for now, was done. They passed a row of tall windows where the morning light filtered through in pale tones, casting long reflections across the polished floor. And for a moment, Oliver slowed, not because he needed to, but because something in the stillness of that light invited pause, a brief space between action and reflection, and he allowed himself to stand there, just for a breath, just long enough to feel the weight of what had happened settle into something quieter, something more defined. A faint memory surfaced then, not sharp, not intrusive, but present, the echo of another place, another time, when instinct had spoken just as quietly, just as firmly, and had been the difference between uncertainty and consequence. And Oliver's jaw tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition, because moments like this are never isolated. They belong to a pattern of experience, a line that runs through a life shaped by paying attention to what others overlook. Rex glanced up at him briefly, his amber eyes steady, calm, and in that look there was something familiar, something grounding, as though the dog understood not just the moment they had shared, but the meaning behind it, the quiet responsibility that comes with sensing what others cannot. And Oliver's hand moved almost instinctively, brushing along Rex's neck in a gesture that carried more than simple reassurance. It carried gratitude, respect, and something deeper, something unspoken but understood. They continued on, moving past the shops and seating areas, past travelers checking their watches and adjusting their bags, each person wrapped in their own journey, their own concerns, unaware of how close the ordinary had come to being interrupted. And Oliver did not feel the need to change that. Because not every truth needs to be known by everyone. Some are held quietly, managed by those who are meant to see them, and left unseen by those who are not. A soft announcement echoed overhead, calling passengers to board, the voice calm, measured, reassuring in its predictability, and Oliver found himself listening to it differently now, not for its content, but for its tone, the steadiness of it, the way it carried normalcy through the space. Because after moments like this, normalcy becomes something to appreciate rather than assume. Rex's pace remained even, his steps aligned with Oliver's, the lead hanging loose between them, a quiet line of trust rather than control. And as they approached a quieter section of the terminal, away from the main flow, Oliver felt the final traces of tension leave his body, not abruptly, but gradually, like a tide receding after reaching its peak, leaving behind clarity in its place. He stopped again briefly, this time not because something felt unfinished, but because something felt complete, at least in this part of the story, and he looked down at Rex, meeting the dog's gaze fully. "Good work," he said softly, the words simple, but carrying everything that needed to be said, and Rex's ears lifted slightly, his expression calm, receptive, as though the acknowledgement mattered, not for praise, but for connection. That could have changed was prevented before it began. He turned then, guiding Rex gently toward the next part of their patrol, not with urgency, not with expectation, but with the steady acceptance that their work would continue, that moments like this may come again, quietly, without warning, and that when they do, it would be the same instinct, the same trust, the same willingness to listen that would make the difference once more. And as they moved forward, blending back into the flow of the terminal, becoming once again just another handler and his dog among many, there was a quiet understanding between them, something deeper than duty, deeper than training, that what they had done was not about recognition or reward. It was about noticing, about choosing to act when something felt wrong, even when no one else could see it. And in that quiet choice, something had been stopped, something that would never be announced, never be known to most, but would remain, nonetheless, as a silent proof that sometimes the smallest signals carry the greatest meaning, and that sometimes the world is kept safe not by noise or force, but by a single moment of attention that refuses to look away. With you, it is the understanding of how easily it could have gone unnoticed. They paused near a quieter seating area, a row of empty chairs facing the wide glass windows that overlooked the runway, the sky still heavy with low gray clouds, the faint outline of aircraft moving slowly in the distance, and Oliver sat down, not out of fatigue, but out of instinct, as though his body needed a moment to catch up with everything his mind had already processed. Rex remained standing at first, then slowly lowered himself beside him, his posture relaxed now, his breathing even, his eyes half-lidded but aware, the way a trained dog never fully disengages, even in rest. For a while, neither of them moved, the silence between them not empty, but full, carrying the weight of what had been seen, what had been stopped, and what would now continue beyond their reach, handled by others, understood in ways that would never fully return to them, and Oliver was at peace with that, because his role had never been to see the whole picture, only to recognize the moment when something did not fit. A group of travelers passed by, their laughter light, unburdened, and Oliver watched them briefly, not with distance, but with a quiet sense of responsibility, because moments like this are not about recognition, they are about preservation, about allowing the world to continue as it should, without interruption, without awareness of what almost changed it. And there was something deeply human in that, something worth protecting even when it went unnoticed. Rex shifted slightly, resting his head gently against Oliver's boot, not a gesture of need, but of closeness, and Oliver's hand moved again, absent-minded, brushing along the dog's neck, slow, steady, the kind of motion that says more than words ever could, because there are bonds that are not built on language, but on shared moments, on trust proven quietly, without expectation. Somewhere in the distance, a faint rumble echoed as an aircraft began its takeoff roll, the sound building gradually, then fading as it lifted into the clouded sky, and Oliver followed it with his eyes for a moment, watching until it disappeared from view. Thinking about how many people on that plane would never know how close something had come to altering their journey, how many lives continued forward unchanged because of a moment that lasted only minutes, unnoticed, unrecorded in any way that would ever reach them. He exhaled slowly, the breath leaving him not in relief, but in understanding, because that is the nature of this kind of work. You do not see the outcome in visible ways. You do not witness the consequences avoided. You simply trust that what you did mattered, that it shifted something, that it kept a line from being crossed, and that has to be enough. Rex lifted his head slightly, his ears twitching once, not in alertness, but in response to the distant sound, and then he settled again, his presence calm, steady, a quiet anchor in a world that often moves too quickly to notice its own fragility. And Oliver looked at him, really looked this time, seeing not just the trained partner, not just the working dog, but the presence, the instinct, The connection that had made all the difference without ever needing to explain itself. "You knew," Oliver said softly, the words almost lost in the ambient noise around them, and Rex blinked slowly, as if the statement required no answer, because knowing, in this sense, is not something that can be explained, it simply is. The moment stretched gently, unhurried, until Oliver finally rose, the movement smooth, purposeful, and Rex followed without hesitation, their alignment returning naturally, effortlessly, as though they had never paused at all, and together they stepped back into the flow of the terminal, becoming once again part of the ordinary world that moved around them, unnoticed, uninterrupted. As they walked, Oliver did not look back this time, not because the moment did not matter, but because it had already settled into something lasting, something that did not require revisiting to remain real. And as the sound of footsteps and voices closed around them once more, there was a quiet certainty that stayed, steady and unshaken, that sometimes the most important things are the ones that never happen, the ones that are stopped before they begin, the ones that leave no mark except in the memory of those who were there, and that in a world full of noise, it is often the quietest signals that matter most, if only someone is willing to listen. The day moved forward as it always does, without pause, without reflection, carrying thousands of lives through the terminal as though nothing had shifted, and in many ways, nothing had, because the most significant changes are often the ones that leave no visible trace, the ones that pass quietly beneath the surface, altering outcomes without altering appearance. And Oliver understood that now more clearly than ever as he and Rex continued their patrol, their presence blending seamlessly into the flow of travelers who would never know what had almost unfolded within the same walls. The light outside had begun to change, softening slightly as the morning edged toward midday, the gray clouds thinning just enough to let a pale brightness filter through, reflecting across the polished floors in long, muted lines, and Oliver found himself noticing these details more keenly, the small shifts, the subtle movements, the quiet transitions that most people pass by without a second thought. Because once you learn to pay attention, truly pay attention, the world reveals itself. Differently, not louder, not clearer, but deeper. Rex walked with him in that same quiet awareness, his steps measured, his presence steady, no longer searching, no longer alert in the way he had been, but still connected, still listening in his own way, the invisible thread between them unchanged, as it always had been, built not on command alone, but on something far more enduring, trust shaped by time, by shared moments, by the simple act of showing up when it mattered most. They passed by a family gathered near a departure gate, a child holding tightly to a small suitcase, his excitement barely contained, his laughter bright against the steady hum of the terminal, and Oliver paused for just a moment, watching, not with distance, but with a quiet understanding of what it meant for moments like that to exist without interruption, without shadow, because the absence of danger is not something people notice. It is something they live within, something they take for granted, and that is precisely what makes it worth protecting. Rex glanced briefly toward the child, his ears lifting slightly, then settling again, his attention returning to Oliver, as though acknowledging the moment in his own silent way, and Oliver gave a small nod, not to the child, not to anyone else, but to the quiet truth that had settled within him, that what they had done mattered, even if it would never be known beyond a handful of people, even if it would never be spoken of in any way that reached the wider world. The sound of another aircraft rose in the distance, low at first, then building as it moved along the runway, a steady, powerful hum that carried with it the weight of journey's beginning, and Oliver followed the sound briefly with his gaze, watching as the plane lifted into the sky, disappearing once more into the layered gray, and there was something in that motion that felt symbolic, not in a grand or dramatic way, but in a quiet, grounded sense, because life continues, always moving forward, regardless of what happens beneath it, regardless of what is prevented before it can take hold. He adjusted his grip on the lead slightly, not to control, but to connect, and Rex responded with a subtle shift, aligning his pace once more, their movement synchronized in a way that required no thought, no instruction, just familiarity. And as they continued through the terminal, the space around them seemed to settle fully back into its normal state. The earlier tension, now nothing more than a memory held between them and a few others, contained, managed, and left behind without trace. Oliver did not dwell on the details of what had been found, not the structure of it, not the intention behind it, because those answers would belong to others now, to investigations and reports and systems far removed from this quiet patrol, and he did not need those answers to understand the significance of what had happened, because significance does not always come from knowing everything. Sometimes it comes from knowing enough to act, and trusting that the rest will follow. Rex slowed slightly as they approached. Another intersection within the terminal, not in alertness, not in concern, but simply adjusting to the flow of people crossing their path, his movements calm, controlled, and Oliver followed without hesitation, allowing the moment to pass naturally. Because there was nothing more to sense here, nothing more to uncover, just the continuation of a day that would remain ordinary for everyone else. He glanced down at Rex once more, his expression softening just slightly, and though he said nothing, the meaning was there, clear, present, carried in the simple act of walking side by side. Because sometimes words are not necessary, sometimes understanding exists fully without them. And as they moved further into the terminal, disappearing into the steady current of travelers, there was a quiet truth that remained, unspoken but certain, that the world is held together not just by what is seen, but by what is noticed in time, by those who choose to pay attention, by those who listen when something does not feel right, even when there is no clear reason, no visible sign, no immediate explanation. Because in the end, it is not the noise that protects us, it is the silence that is understood, the instinct that is trusted, and the moment when someone decides not to look away, even when everyone else already has.